everybody. I'm going to continue today with my book about who is Jane Goodall. And in 1943, Vanee, who was Jane's mother, and her daughters moved into their own home in Bournemouth, England. Jane spent the rest of her childhood there. Jane was 8 at this time. By then, Mortimer was living apart from his wife and daughters. Jane was most happy when she was outdoors with a neighborhood dog named Rusty. She started a nature club with her sister and 2 friends. Jane had lots of rules for the club. Jane, of course, was the leader. Members had to be able to identify all sorts of different animals. Each member had a code name. The club was fun and interesting, but Jane's friends thought sometimes she was too bossy. Jane also loved reading books about animals. The story of Dr. Dolittle by Hugh Lofting was one of her favorites. Dr. Dolittle went to Africa and was able to talk to wild animals. Jane understood that she would never be able to carry on a conversation with a tiger or a giraffe or a monkey, but she knew it was possible to live in Africa, to be close to wild animals. By the time she was 10, she had decided that's exactly what she was going to do with her life. And here's a picture of her with her friends, with their little club. Had a lot of fun together. By 1952, Jane's parents were divorced. She didn't ever lose touch with her father, but she was never close to him the way she was with Vanee. Jane was graduating from high school. Although she had been a very good student, there was not enough money for her to go to college. So Jane moved to London and took a job as a secretary. The city was a thrilling place to live. However, Jane told her mother and grandmother that her work was dull. It made her miserable. Through a friend, she found a job at a company that made films. That was much more interesting. And there's a picture of Jane working at her job. Still, Jane never stopped dreaming of Africa, to live there and find work studying animals in their natural homes. The odds were not in Jane's favor. First of all, in the 1950s, scientists studied animals in zoos or labs, not in the wild. Animal scientists had years of education. Jane had no college degree, and at the time, even women with degrees were limited in their career choices. Most became teachers or went into nursing. So how would Jane find a way to live the life she longed for? In 1956, a letter came that changed Jane's life. It was from an old friend named Chloe. Chloe's family had bought a farm in Kenya, Africa. Chloe wanted Jane to visit. Did Jane think twice about going? And there's Jane with the invitation from her friend Chloe to go to Kenya, Africa. Of course not. She didn't think twice at all. Traveling to Africa was expensive. Living in London was expensive too. So Jane moved back home with her mother in Bournemouth. She saved up money for the trip by working as a waitress. Jane was a very good waitress. She could carry as many as 13 plates balanced on her arms. There's a picture of her being a waitress, saving money to go to Africa. And next time we read, we'll see when she actually gets to go. Now I know school is starting, and this is a fun book called Mr. Peabody's Apples. I like this book, and I like the drawings in it. Look at the beautiful picture of that apple. Mr. Peabody's Apples. And this is Mr. Peabody, and this is Billy Little. You see him there? And that's who the story is about. It says, "Welcome to Hapville." Look at that. That's the water tower. Look at the kids playing baseball and just having a great time. Whoa, yes. In the town of Hapville, which wasn't a very big town, Mr. Peabody was congratulating his Little League team on a great game. They had not won, but no one really cared because they'd had such a good time playing. Mr. Peabody was the history teacher at the local elementary school, and in the summertime, he dedicated every Saturday to organizing baseball games with other schools. Billy Little, who wasn't a very big boy, was one of Mr. Peabody's students. He loved baseball more than anything, and he thought that Mr. Peabody was just the greatest. After each game, he would always stay to help pick up all the bats and balls, and when they were finished, Mr. Peabody would smile and say, "Thanks, Billy. Good job. I'll see you next Saturday." There's Mr. Peabody with the boys. That was really nice of him to do, wasn't it? Then he would start his walk home along the main streets of Hapville, which wasn't a very big street, waving hello to everyone he knew, and everyone would wave hello back. Along the way, he always passed Mr. Funkadeli's fruit market. Here, Mr. Peabody would stop and admire Mr. Funkadeli's fresh apples. He would pick out the shiniest apple, drop it in his bag, and continue on his way. Across the street, Tommy Tittlebottom watched with curiosity as Mr. Peabody walked away with the apple. "That's strange," Tommy said to himself. "Mr. Peabody didn't pay anyone for the apple." Tommy got on his skateboard and rushed to tell his friends. There's Mr. Peabody picking out that beautiful shiny apples at Mr. Funkadeli's fruit market. The following Saturday, Mr. Peabody's team played another game, and they lost, as usual. But no one seemed to care because they'd had such a good time playing ball. Billy picked up the balls and bats, and Mr. Peabody set off on his walk home. He waved to everyone he knew, and they waved back. Once again, he stopped outside Mr. Funkadeli's fruit market, picked up the shiniest apple, dropped it in his bag, and continued on his way. Across the street, Tommy Tittlebottom and his friends watched Mr. Peabody, and they were amazed at what they saw. Mr. Peabody had not paid for his apple. They couldn't wait to tell all of their friends, who told their parents, who told their neighbors, who told their friends, in the town of Hapville, which wasn't a very big town. So you can see they're across the street watching Mr. Peabody pick out that apple. The Saturday after that, Mr. Peabody was standing all alone on the baseball field. He was wondering where everybody was. Then he saw Billy walking toward him with a sad look on his face. "Hello, Billy. I'm glad you're here. But where is the rest of the team?" asked Mr. Peabody. Billy remained silent. "What is it, Billy?" he asked again. Billy didn't look up. "Everybody thinks you're a thief," he said to the ground. Mr. Peabody looked confused. He took off his hat and scratched his head. "Who says I am a thief, Billy? And what did I steal?" he asked. "Well, Tommy Tittlebottom and his friends said they saw you take an apple from Mr. Funkadeli's fruit market twice, and they said you didn't pay for them," answered Billy. "Ah," said Mr. Peabody, putting his hat back on his head. "Let's go and talk to Mr. Funkadeli about it, shall we?" So there's Mr. Peabody, and they're going to go talk to Mr. Funkadeli. And there's poor Billy with looking at the ground saying, "Everybody thinks you're a thief." Oh, Billy looks so sad. They walked down the main street, which wasn't really a very big street. And Mr. Peabody waved to all the people he knew. But now some of them did not wave back, and some pretended they did not even see him. They finally arrived at Mr. Funkadeli's fruit market. Out popped Mr. Funkadeli, who said, "Hey, what are you doing here, Mr. Peabody? Why aren't you at the game?" "Oh, there wasn't a game today," said Mr. Peabody, "and I was wondering if I could take my apple earlier than usual." "Sure, why not?" replied Mr. Funkadeli. "You pay for them every Saturday morning when you pick up your milk. You can take them when you like. You want the big shiny one, Mr. Peabody?" Mr. Peabody took his apple, smiled, and offered it to Billy. I would like to take the apple, Mr. Peabody, but I have to go and find Tommy and explain everything, said Billy. When you find him, ask him to come over to my house. I would like to speak to him too, replied Mr. Peabody. There they are at Mr. Funkadeli's market. A little while later, Billy found Tommy and told him what had happened with the apples. He told Tommy that Mr. Peabody wanted to speak to him right away. So off Tommy ran, and when he arrived, he rang the doorbell, and Mr. Peabody came to the door. They looked at each other for a while. "Oh dear, Mr. Peabody," said Tommy on the doorstep. "I didn't understand. I should not have said what I said. But it looked like you hadn't paid for your apples." Mr. Peabody's eyebrows went up a little, and he felt a warm breeze blow across his face. "It doesn't matter what it looked like. What matters is the truth." Tommy looked down at his shoes and said, "I'm so sorry. What can I do to make things better now?" Mr. Peabody took a deep breath. He looked up at a small cloud that was in the sky and said, "I'll tell you what, Tommy. Meet me at the baseball diamond in 1 hour and bring a pillow stuffed with feathers." "Okay," said Tommy, who then ran off to his house to get a pillow. Wonder what they're going to do with that pillow. An hour later, Tommy met Mr. Peabody on the pitcher's mound. "Hello, Tommy," said Mr. Peabody. "Follow me and bring your pillow." Tommy followed Mr. Peabody to the top of the bleachers, wondering what this was all about. "It's a windy day, isn't it?" asked Mr. Peabody when they reached the top. Tommy nodded his head in agreement. "Well, here's a pair of scissors. Now cut the pillow in half and shake the feathers out." Tommy looked confused, but did it anyway. He thought it was a small price to pay to gain Mr. Peabody's forgiveness. The wind carried the thousands of feathers far and wide. Oh dear. Oh, look at all those feathers just being spread everywhere. Tommy looked relieved and said, "Is that all I have to do to make things better?" "Well, there's one more thing," said Mr. Peabody. "Now you must go and pick up all the feathers." Tommy frowned. "I don't think it's possible to pick up all the feathers," Tommy replied. "Well, it would be just as impossible to undo the damage that you have done by spreading the rumor that I am a thief." Mr. Peabody said, "Each feather represents a person in Hapville." There was a long pause as Tommy began to understand what Mr. Peabody was saying. Finally he said, "I guess I have a lot of work ahead of me, Mr. Peabody." Mr. Peabody smiled and said, "Indeed you do. Next time, don't be so quick to judge a person, and remember the power of your words." Then he handed Tommy the shiny red apple, and Mr. Peabody made his way home. And look at on the bed. I don't know if he got every feather, but can you see how he sewed the pillow back together and got some of the feathers? But he could probably never collect every feather. So just like when we start to talk and say things that we're not sure about, we need to be careful and remember the power of our words, don't we? Mr. Peabody's apples. I love that story. And you know what else? I love you. Good night.
Amen.